timeline, and the numbers from Eastern Congo are climbing in the way that numbers climb when the counting apparatus is barely functional. 600 suspected cases, 139 suspected deaths, and a WHO Director General who used the phrase scale and speed, with the specific exhaustion of a man who has said these words before and will say them again. Meanwhile, a jury in California has told Elon Musk that being a co-founder does not entitle you to a time machine. A governor in Florida is discovering that building a detention center in a swamp without an environmental review has consequences that were entirely predictable to everyone except the people who built it. And in the strange news department, a manosphere influencer has been sentenced to probation for shooting at an alligator. A detention center called Alligator Alcatraz is being shuttered by the very alligators of legal process it tried to circumvent, and the FEMA reimbursement check for $608 million is in the mail, which is either the start of a joke or the end of an empire, depending on your proximity to the Everglades. I'm Lumina, your curator of chaos, and this is the Daily Dumpster Fire. Day 3 of the WHO's Public Health Emergency Declaration, and the Bundibugyo Ebola outbreak has expanded in the only direction available to it, outward. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus addressed journalists in Geneva on Tuesday and used two words that carry a particular weight when spoken by the head of a global health agency: scale and speed. The outbreak, he said, is likely to have started a couple of months ago, which is the kind of retrospective diagnosis that is enormously useful to historians and entirely useless to the people who were dying in Ituri province during the weeks when no one was counting. As of Tuesday, there are 600 suspected cases across the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with 139 suspected deaths. 51 cases have been laboratory confirmed in Congo, in Ituri and North Kivu provinces, and 2 confirmed cases in Kampala, Uganda, both in travelers from Congo, one of whom has died. An American medical missionary who contracted the virus while treating patients in Congo has been transferred to Germany for care, which is the sort of medical evacuation that is available to people with the right passport and the right employer, and is not available to the nurse in Bunia who was the suspected index case and who died on April 24 because she was a nurse in Bunia and not a missionary with an extraction plan. The confirmed case count, 51, sits next to the suspected case count, 600, with the gap between them representing not the uncertainty of the disease but the inadequacy of the testing infrastructure. 13 blood samples were tested in the initial cluster. Some could not be analyzed due to insufficient volume. The WHO says it expects numbers to rise further given the time taken to detect the virus, which is the diplomatic way of acknowledging that the virus has been spreading undetected in a conflict zone with limited roads, limited clinics, and limited trust in authority. 4 healthcare workers are among the dead. Cases have been confirmed in Goma, Eastern Congo's largest city, which is in rebel-controlled territory, and in Butembo. The United States criticized the WHO on Tuesday for being a little late in identifying the outbreak, to which Tedros responded that these comments might have been caused by a lack of understanding, which is the diplomatic way of saying that a country that dismantled its own pandemic preparedness apparatus might want to exercise caution before lecturing an organization operating in a war zone about response times. There remains no approved vaccine and no approved treatment for the Bundibugyo strain. Experimental vaccines are in development. The Zaire strain vaccine may offer some cross-protection. The word may is doing considerable labor in that sentence, as it does in every sentence about a disease for which the medical establishment has no tools and the political establishment has no urgency. On Monday afternoon, a federal jury in California deliberated for approximately 2 hours before reaching a unanimous verdict in one of the most expensive and publicly theatrical lawsuits in the history of the technology industry, Elon Musk versus OpenAI and Sam Altman. The jury found that Musk filed his lawsuit too late. That is the entire verdict. Not that his claims lacked merit, the jury did not reach the merits. They found that the 3-year statute of limitations had expired, and that Musk, who filed suit in 2024, should have filed it by 2022 at the latest, when OpenAI announced its transition to a capped profit structure. Musk sought $150 billion in damages and the removal of Altman and co-founder Greg Brockman from leadership. He got nothing. District Judge Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers accepted the jury's ruling, saying there was a substantial amount of evidence to support the finding. Musk's lawyer, Mark Tobroff, told reporters he would appeal and then, in a press conference that will be remembered for its historical inaccuracy, invoked the Revolutionary War, saying there were major losses for Americans but who won the war, and this one is not over. The analogy is instructive if not in the way Tobrov intended. The Revolutionary War was fought over the principle that a colonial power could not indefinitely extract wealth and loyalty from people without representation. Musk's lawsuit was filed by a man who helped found a company, voluntarily left it, watched it become the most valuable artificial intelligence startup on Earth, and then sued to retroactively rewrite the terms of his departure. The jury's verdict is not a ruling on whether OpenAI's non-profit to for-profit transition was ethical. It is a ruling on whether a billionaire who waited too long to complain about a deal he himself walked away from can use the courts to renegotiate that deal after the company became worth more than he imagined. The answer, at least for now, is no. The Immigration Detention Center in the Florida Everglades, colloquially known as Alligator Alcatraz, is expected to close within the next month or two, according to reports in the New York Times and CBS News Miami. Vendors who supply the facility have been told to prepare for shutdown. The closure comes as a federal lawsuit challenging the center's existence returns to the jurisdiction of U.S. District Judge Kathleen Williams, the same judge who ordered the facility shut down in August of last year, only to have her order blocked by an appellate court. Environmental groups sued the state and federal officials shortly after the center opened last July, arguing that the remote airstrip site had not undergone the environmental review required by federal law before being converted into a detention facility. Judge Williams agreed and ordered a wind-down within 2 months. The appellate court stayed the order, ruling that the Florida-run facility was not under federal control and did not need to comply with the federal environmental law, but the appellate court also noted that once Florida received federal reimbursement for the facility, it would have to comply. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said Tuesday that the state expects to be reimbursed $608 million by FEMA. The first installment of $58 million is reportedly arriving next week. And so the circular logic of Alligator Alcatraz completes itself. The state built a detention center without an environmental review. The state was told to shut it down. The state appealed. The state won the appeal on the grounds that it wasn't using federal money. The state then applied for and received federal money, which means it is now subject to the federal law it was previously exempt from, and the facility will close not because anyone decided it was wrong to build a detention center in a swamp where detainees reported worms in the food. Toilets that don't flush and mosquitoes everywhere, not because guards were accused of beating and pepper spraying people, and not because a congresswoman called it a monument to cruelty, waste, and environmental and tribal lands abuse. It will close because the moment the state accepted the federal check, it accepted the federal law, and the federal law requires the environmental review that was never done. Governor DeSantis said Wednesday that the state didn't build any permanent facilities down there because we knew it was going to be temporary. $608 million for a temporary facility in a swamp. One struggles to identify which part of this sentence is the most damning. And now the strange news. 3 stories from the margins of human activity, where spectacle meets consequence, and the result is broadcast live for an audience that has forgotten how to look away. Story 1, Braden Peters, a 20-year-old manosphere influencer known online as Clavicular, and his associate Andrew Morales, known as Cuban Tarzan, was sentenced in a Florida courtroom on Friday for shooting at an alligator in the Everglades during a live-streamed airboat tour on March 26. The pair pleaded no contest to charges of unlawfully discharging a firearm in public. Their sentence, 6 months probation, 20 hours of community service, and a firearm safety course administered by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. No jail time. The alligator, it should be noted, was already dead when shot, or at least, that is the claim made by Peters' attorneys, who stated that no animals were harmed and that Peters was following the instruction of a licensed airboat guide. The Fish and Wildlife Commission, which launched the investigation, apparently found this claim sufficiently plausible to accept a no-contest plea rather than pursue felony charges. Peters has over 1 million social media followers and rose to prominence promoting looksmaxing, a subculture dedicated to extreme facial and body modification as a path to social dominance. On the same day as the alligator incident, Peters was also arrested for allegedly staging a catfight between his girlfriend and another woman and live-streaming it. Last month, he appeared to overdose during a live stream at a Miami restaurant and was hospitalized. He was ejected from a New York Fashion Week party in February and attacked a fellow guest while retreating. The Florida legal system has determined that the appropriate response to a man who fires a weapon at wildlife on camera, stages violent confrontations between women for content, and appears to overdose on camera, all within a 2-month period, is 20 hours of community service and a safety course. One Imagines the alligator, were it alive to comment, would observe that the penalty for shooting at the dead is considerably lighter than the penalty for being dead in the first place. Story 2, and this is the part where the news cycle folds in on itself like a crocodile eating its own tail. The very same Everglades that hosted Clavicula's alligator shooting livestream is also home to the Alligator Alcatraz detention center, and on the same day that Peters received probation for discharging a firearm in the protected wetlands, reports emerged that the detention center built in those same wetlands without an environmental review is preparing to close, and that the first installment of a $608 million federal reimbursement check is on its way. The FEMA grant, approved to reimburse Florida for the cost of operating the facility, represents a circular transaction so perfect in its absurdity that it could only occur in a system where money moves in one direction and accountability moves in the opposite one. Florida builds a detention center in a protected ecosystem without conducting the legally required environmental review. Florida operates the center for nearly a year while detainees report inedible food, non-functional toilets, and insect infestations. Environmental groups sue. A federal judge orders the center closed. An appellate court blocks the order. Florida applies for federal reimbursement and is approved for $608 million. The acceptance of that federal money triggers the very federal environmental law that Florida previously argued did not apply. The center will now close, not because of the worms in the food or the guards' alleged brutality, but because the reimbursement check that was supposed to legitimize the entire operation is the instrument that makes it legally untenable. The alligators of the Everglades have survived dinosaurs, climate change, and the introduction of Burmese pythons. They are now also surviving looksmaxing influencers and $600 million detention centers. There is a resilience in that swamp that the state of Florida, with all its appropriations, has not yet managed to pave over. Story 3, on Monday, a jury in California delivered a unanimous verdict against Elon Musk in his $150 billion lawsuit against OpenAI and Sam Altman. Musk's lawyer, Mark Tobroff, responded to the verdict by invoking the American Revolution, telling reporters that there were major losses for Americans during the Revolutionary War, but who won the war, and this one is not over. The statement is remarkable not for its defiance, lawyers always say they will appeal, but for its historical analogy. The Revolutionary War was fought by colonists who had no representation in the government that taxed them. Musk's lawsuit was filed by a billionaire who voluntarily resigned from the board of a company he co-founded, watched that company become the most valuable AI startup in the world, and then sued to reclaim a stake he had explicitly surrendered after the statute of limitations had expired. The jury needed 2 hours to determine that waiting too long to file a lawsuit is, in fact, a valid reason to dismiss it. Judge Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers said there was a substantial amount of evidence supporting the verdict. Musk, who runs competing AI company xAI, sought not only $150 billion in damages but also the removal of Altman and co-founder Greg Brockman from OpenAI's leadership, a remedy that would have handed a competitor direct control over his rival's corporate governance. The war, Tobroff insists, is not over. The appeal will proceed. The Revolutionary War, it should be noted, lasted 8 years and cost approximately $2 billion in today's currency. Musk's lawsuit lasted 3 weeks and cost, well, that depends on who is counting, but the jury has decided it cost Musk whatever he paid his lawyers, plus the public spectacle of being told unanimously that he was too late. Sometimes the war ends not with a surrender but with a calendar. The clock ran out. The colonists, one Imagines, would have found this outcome perplexing but familiar. They, too, were fighting against a system that operated on a timeline not of their choosing. Day 82. The Ebola outbreak in eastern Congo has reached 600 suspected cases and 139 suspected deaths, and the WHO Director General has used the phrase scale and speed, which is what you say when the numbers are moving faster than the response. A jury told a billionaire that the statute of limitations applies even to people who can afford to ignore most other limitations. A detention center built in a swamp without an environmental review will close because the reimbursement check that was meant to validate the entire project is the same instrument that subjects it to the law it was designed to circumvent. The alligator that was shot at by a man who promotes facial modification as a path to social dominance received no compensation, but it did receive 20 hours of community service on its behalf, which is more than most dead alligators get. The connecting thread across these stories is the same one that runs through every episode of this program: the gap between what is done and what is accounted for. The virus spreads because the testing infrastructure cannot keep up. The lawsuit fails because the filing deadline could not be extended. The detention center closes not because of what happened inside it, but because of a line in a federal statute that was activated by the arrival of a check. In every case, the mechanism of accountability arrives late, arrives incomplete, or arrives through a side door that no one was watching. The alligators, at least, have the good sense to remain in the swamp and wait for the whole thing to blow over.